The betrayal did not arrive in private. It did not come in a whispered letter or a quiet conversation behind closed doors. Instead, it unfolded beneath the massive crystal chandeliers of Lady Halveridge's ballroom, right as the polite applause of the spring reception was beginning to fade. I stood there, Miss Ophelia Davenforth, feeling the heat of 100 gazes. Lady Halveridge had called me forward, but it wasn't an invitation to dance or a gesture of kindness. It was a summons. The distinction burned like a brand against my skin. As I walked toward the front of the room, the laughter of the guests faltered. The air grew heavy and thick, like storm clouds gathering before a lightning strike. I could see the calculated look in Lady Halveridge's eyes, a chilling elegance that masked a sharp, surgical cruelty. She spoke a single sentence, a precise accusation that questioned my very right to stand among the respectable families of the ton. My pulse thundered in my ears, and for a moment I thought I might faint. I knew exactly what this was. In our world, reputation was the only currency that mattered, and mine was being drained away in front of everyone I had ever known. My eyes darted to the side, searching for the one man who knew the truth. Lord Lucian Everwick stood just yards away, composed and untouchable. He was the architect of my quiet ruin, and as he stepped away from the crowd, I felt the final thread of my hope snap. I braced myself for the weight of total abandonment. This was how the game was played. When one person was marked for destruction, everyone else moved back to avoid the bloodstains. I watched Lucian, expecting him to turn his back completely. His stillness felt like a loud confirmation of his betrayal. He had been the one I trusted, the one I had shared my secrets with, and now he was watching me be dismantled piece by piece. The silence in the room was deafening as the guests waited for my collapse. I kept my chin up, even though my knees were shaking. I expected the doors to open and the servants to usher me out into the cold night, never to be heard from again. Lady Halveridge smiled, a predatory expression that told me she had already won. She looked at the crowd as if inviting them to join in the feast of my humiliation. But then, something shifted. The sound of boots against the polished floor broke the silence. I looked toward the door, expecting a guard, but I saw Lucian instead. He had stopped moving away. He stood at the edge of the circle, his hands clasped behind his back, his dark eyes locked on mine. He did not leave the room. He did not look away. He stood there like a statue, watching the executioner raise the axe, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something other than coldness in his expression. The room held its breath. Lady Halveridge began to speak again, ready to deliver the final blow that would exile me forever, but she was interrupted. It wasn't a shout, it was a voice that was calm, precise, and entirely unapologetic. Lord Lucian Everwick stepped back into the light of the chandeliers. He did not look at Lady Halveridge. He looked only at me. "I believe there has been a misunderstanding," he said, and the authority in his voice was so absolute that the guests actually stepped back to make a path for him. He walked slowly, every step a challenge to the rules of the season. When he reached my side, he didn't just stand near me. He placed a hand on the small of my back, a public claim that sent a shockwave through the assembly. This was impossible. Lucian was a man who valued his own reputation above all else. He was the one who had led me into this trap, or so I had thought. But now, he was standing in the center of the storm, blocking the wind. "Miss Davenforth is not here to be questioned," he announced to the shocked faces of the elite. "She is here as my intended." He declared it with such certainty that for a second, even the violins seemed to stop. I looked up at him, my heart hammering, unable to comprehend his words. This was a lie, a dangerous, beautiful lie. Gasps rippled through the room like a wave hitting the shore. Alliances that had been built over decades fractured in the space of a single glance. I saw mothers pulling their daughters away, and men whispering frantically to their wives. The very air seemed to vibrate with the scandal of it. A duke's son, the most eligible bachelor of the year, had just claimed a woman whose name was being dragged through the mud. It was social suicide, yet Lucian looked as if he were merely discussing the weather. I couldn't breathe. My mind was racing, trying to find the logic in what he had just done. Was this a new part of his game? Was he trying to humiliate me further by offering a hope he would later snatch away? I searched his face for a sign of a smirk or a hidden motive, but his expression was as solid as granite. He didn't look like a man who was playing a prank. He looked like a man who was declaring war on his own society. Lady Halveridge's face turned a mottled purple, her composure finally breaking. "Lord Everwick, you cannot be serious," she sputtered. Lucian didn't even blink. "I am always serious, Lady Halveridge, and I suggest you choose your next words very carefully." Ophelia felt the world spinning. She couldn't understand why the man she feared most had just become her only shield. As the crowd began to murmur and move again, my mind flashed back to the beginning of the season. I remembered the first time I had trusted Lucian. It was a cold afternoon in the park, and he had promised me that my family's secrets were safe with him. He had been so charming, so attentive, that I had forgotten he was a predator by nature. But then, the letters had leaked. My father's debts, my mother's past, everything I had told him in confidence had become the gossip of every tea room in London. I had been sure it was him. Who else knew the details? Who else had the power to distribute that information so effectively? That was the lesson of distrust I had learned so painfully. I had spent weeks mourning the friendship I thought we had, replaced by a cold, hard anger. I had looked at him across ballrooms and seen a monster. That emotional grounding was what made this moment so confusing. If he had betrayed me then, why was he saving me now? The truth remained a dark, uncertain thing. I felt like a bird that had been shot down, only to be caught by the person who held the gun. Was he truly my protector, or was he simply making sure he was the only one who got to destroy me? Across the room, I saw the person who had whispered the loudest into Lady Halveridge's ear. Lady Cressida Mornvale stood by the refreshment table, a glass of dark wine in her pale hand. She was the definition of elegance, her silk gown a shimmering emerald green. She was composed and quietly triumphant, her eyes following Lucian's every move. Cressida had been the one to comfort me when the scandals first broke, but now I saw the truth in her cold, dark eyes. She was the one who had set the dogs on me. She was the antagonist I hadn't seen coming. She didn't look angry that Lucian had intervened, she looked intrigued. Her smile didn't reach her eyes, and there was a predatory sharpness to her posture. I realized that she and Lady Halveridge were working together, but for what end? My family was respectable but not wealthy. I had no grand title to steal. Her motives were unclear, and that made her far more dangerous than an open enemy. She took a slow sip of her wine, her gaze locking onto mine for a brief second before she turned to the person beside her. I felt a cold chill settle in my chest. Lucian had stepped in front of the bullet, but Cressida still had plenty of ammunition left in her belt. As Lucian led me away from the center of the floor, the world felt like it was shifting on its axis. I began to question everything I had believed about the last few months. I looked at the way he held himself, the tension in his jaw and the way he checked the room for threats. He didn't look like a man who had betrayed a friend. He looked like a man who was carrying a heavy burden. I thought about the letters again. Was it possible that I had been wrong? Evidence began to contradict my memory. I remembered seeing a man who looked like Lucian's valet leaving the printer's shop, but now I wondered if that had been a setup. If Lucian hadn't leaked my secrets, then someone had gone to great lengths to make me think he had. The realization made me feel dizzy. I had hated him for months, fueled by a betrayal that might not have even happened. "Why are you doing this?" I whispered as we reached a quiet alcove. Lucian stopped and looked down at me, his eyes searching mine. "Because I am the only one who can fix the mess I allowed to happen, Ophelia," he said quietly. His voice was thick with a regret I hadn't expected. Cliffhanger. Was he the villain, or had he just been a bystander to a much larger crime? The whispers did not stop, they only changed direction. Instead of whispering about my ruin, people were now whispering about the madness of Lord Everwick. My reputation was still under a heavy siege, but now it was tied to his. Public perception worsened by the minute as the older lords began to grumble about his lack of judgment. To the ton, a man like Lucian shouldn't throw away his future for a girl like me. It was seen as an insult to the entire social order. I felt the weight of it every time someone turned their back on us or pretended we weren't there. We were in a bubble of disgrace, even if it was a golden one. Lucien remained immovable. He didn't flinch when his oldest friends walked past without a word. He didn't blink when the matrons scoffed at us from their chairs. He stood beside me with a terrifying calm, his presence a shield I didn't yet know if I could trust. I felt like we were standing on a tiny island while the ocean rose all around us. They hate us, I said, looking at a group of girls who were giggling and pointing. They hate anything they can't predict, Lucien replied, his grip on my hand tightening just a fraction. Despite the social consequences, Lucien did not move from my side. He danced every dance with me, and he stood with me during the dinner service, even when the table remained half empty. It was a dangerous alignment. By staying with me, he was risking his own inheritance and his seat in the Lords. Why would a man who had everything to lose risk it all for someone he had supposedly betrayed? The logic didn't fit the man I thought I knew. I looked at him throughout the night, trying to see past the polished mask. I saw the way he watched the doors and the way his eyes lingered on Lady Cressida. He wasn't just being a gentleman, he was on the hunt. He was waiting for something to happen. I realized that my scandal wasn't just a bit of gossip to him, it was a move in a much larger game. I was a piece on the board, but for the first time, I felt like I was on the side of the player rather than being played. "You're going to lose everything," I warned him as we stood near the garden doors. He looked at me, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "There are some things worth losing everything for, Ophelia. I just took too long to realize it." The next morning, the real reason for the attack surfaced. Lucien met me at my family's small town home, looking tired but determined. He brought a file of papers that smelled of old dust and ink. "The accusation Lady Halveridge made wasn't about your behavior, Ophelia," he said, spreading the papers on the table. "It was about your great-uncle's estate. The inheritance you were never supposed to know about." My breath hitched. My great-uncle had been a recluse, and we had been told he died penniless. But the documents showed a vast fortune and a land claim that would make the Davenforths one of the wealthiest families in the country. The scandal had been a calculated attempt to ruin my reputation so that the estate would pass to the next person in line, Lady Cressida Mornvale. The stakes exploded in my mind. My position was completely destabilized. I wasn't just a girl whose feelings had been hurt, I was the target of a massive financial conspiracy. Cressida didn't just want to embarrass me, she wanted to steal my future. I looked at the papers, my hands trembling. I had been walking through a minefield while thinking I was just in a bad dream. Lucien had found the truth, but the question remained, could he stop them before they finished what they started? Lady Cressida's strategy began to emerge in full. She didn't hide in the shadows anymore. She began to host her own parties, inviting only the most influential people and subtly reminding them that the Everwick Davenforth union was a disgrace to the crown. Her precision was terrifying. She wasn't just attacking me, she was attacking the very idea of Lucien's leadership. She was making it so that even if he stayed with me, he would be a duke with no power and no friends. It was a survival-driven move for her. Her own family was drowning in debt, and the inheritance was the only thing that could save them. She was willing to burn down the entire social season to get what she wanted. But as Lucien and I dug deeper, we realized she wasn't the only one pulling the strings. Someone else was providing her with the information and the legal muscle. There was a hidden architect behind the curtain, someone with even more to gain than Cressida. I felt a sense of mounting dread. We were fighting a ghost. Every time we thought we had a lead, it vanished. The season was unmaking us, just as the plan intended. We spent hours in the legal districts, searching for the original will. "It's here somewhere," Lucien muttered, his eyes red from reading in the dim light. "If we find the document that proves your great-uncle was of sound mind, Cressida's claim collapses." We found a hint of it in an old ledger, a document that was never meant to surface. It was a letter from my uncle to his lawyer, specifically mentioning a secret safe in his country house. But just as we reached out to the lawyer's office, the document vanished. The ledger was stolen from the archives, and the lawyer suddenly left for the continent without a word. The evidence we needed was being erased as fast as we could find it. It was a race against a shadow. I realized then how much power our enemy had. They weren't just influential, they were embedded in the very system that was supposed to protect us. "They're watching us," I whispered as we left the empty office. Lucien looked around the dark street, his hand resting on the hilt of his cane. "Let them watch," he said, his voice hard. "They're about to see what happens when you push a man too far." That night, Lucien finally told me the truth about the letters. We sat in his library, the fire casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. "I didn't leak them, Ophelia," he said, his voice low and pained. "But I was the one who left them on my desk. I thought I was among friends. I thought my study was safe." He explained that he had been investigating Cressida's father and had kept the notes about my family in the same folder. Someone had stolen the folder while he was in a meeting. He had spent months trying to find out who, but by then, the damage was done. He had stayed away from me not because he was guilty of the leak, but because he was ashamed of his own carelessness. He had been trying to protect me from afar, but he had only made me feel more alone. The emotional tension between us deepened. I saw the burden he had been carrying, the guilt of a man who prided himself on his control but had failed the one person who mattered. He withheld the final piece of the puzzle, though. He still wouldn't tell me who he suspected was the true architect. "It's too dangerous for you to know yet," he said, and for the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. Society's appetite for ruin only grew as the weeks went by. The hostility was no longer just whispered, it was open. People would make loud comments about fortune hunters when I walked by. My family was harassed by debt collectors who had been tipped off by anonymous sources. It felt like the world was trying to crush us into the dirt. We were exhausted, and our hope was beginning to fray. Then, an unexpected ally appeared. Sir Allard Penwith, a man who rarely spoke at parties and was mostly known for his interest in rare books, began to follow us at a distance. He didn't say anything at first, but he was always there, a quiet, perceptive presence at the edge of every gathering. He watched Lady Cressida with a strange intensity, his eyes missing nothing. I didn't know if he was a friend or another enemy waiting for his turn, but his presence was a constant. "He's watching her," I noted to Lucien. Lucien looked at Allard and nodded slowly. "He's not watching her for the scandal, Ophelia. He's watching her because he knows where the bodies are buried." Sir Allard finally approached us in the middle of a crowded park. He didn't bother with a formal greeting. He simply handed Lucien a small, leather-bound book. "Page 42, he said, and then he walked away as if nothing had happened. He was the observer no one noticed, but he held the decisive knowledge we had been searching for. When we opened the book, we found a list of names and dates. It was a log of everyone who had visited my great-uncle in his final days. And there, on the list, was a name that made my blood turn to ice. It wasn't Cressida. It was the lawyer who had supposedly fled to the continent. But he hadn't gone alone. He had been accompanied by Lady Halveridge's husband. The true manipulator was revealed. It wasn't a jealous girl's game. It was a high-stakes theft by one of the most powerful men in the country. Allard had known for years, but he had been waiting for someone strong enough to take them on. "He gave us the map," Lucien said, his eyes alight with a new fire. "Now we just have to find the treasure." The revelation was devastating. I learned that my great-uncle hadn't died of old age. He had been pressured and isolated by Lord Halveridge until he signed a series of documents he didn't understand. The scandal against me was a smokescreen to prevent me from ever looking into the details of his death. If I was ruined, I would never have the social standing to challenge a lord in court. My memory was reframed in a heartbeat. All the little accidents that had happened to my family over the years, the lost jobs, the failed investments, they weren't bad luck. They were a coordinated campaign to keep us poor and weak. Lucien's actions were reframed as well. He hadn't been avoiding me out of shame. He had been trying to track the Halveridges' money trail without alerting them. "They've been hunting you for a long time, Ophelia," he said, his voice soft with anger. "And I almost let them catch you." The emotional shock was overwhelming, but it was replaced by a cold, hard clarity. I wasn't going to be a victim anymore. I was going to be the person who brought their house of cards down. As we began to make our moves, the antagonist faltered. Lady Cressida began to realize that she was just a tool for the Halveridges. She hadn't known about the true nature of my uncle's death, and the weight of the conspiracy began to crush her. Fear replaced her certainty. She started to make mistakes, speaking out of turn and looking over her shoulder at every party. The pressure from Lucian was relentless. He began to buy up Lord Halveridge's debts and question his business partners in public. He was squeezing them, and Cressida was caught in the middle. I saw her at a garden party, her face pale and her hands shaking as she tried to hold a teacup. She looked at me, and for the first time, I didn't see a predator. I saw a girl who was terrified of the monsters she had aligned herself with. "She's going to break," I told Lucian. He didn't look away from the Halveridges. "Good," he said. "The storm is almost here." The grand social reckoning was scheduled for the end of the season, the midsummer gala. Everyone who was anyone would be there. It was the night the Halveridges planned to officially announce the transfer of my uncle's estate to a charitable trust they controlled. It was our last chance to stop them. If the documents were signed in front of witnesses, it would take years to undo the damage. The air was electric with the coming confrontation. We had the evidence, but we needed to deliver it in a way that couldn't be ignored. We were walking into a room full of people who had spent the last few months mocking us, and we were going to ask them to believe a story of murder and theft. It was an irreversible confrontation. I spent the day in a state of quiet terror, but every time I looked at Lucian, I felt a surge of strength. We weren't just fighting for money or a name. We were fighting for the truth. "Are you ready?" he asked as we stepped into the carriage. I took a deep breath and nodded. "Let's unmake them." The ballroom was a sea of silk and gold, but it felt like a battlefield to me. We entered the room, and the silence followed us like a shadow. People stopped talking as we walked past, their eyes full of judgment and curiosity. Lord Halveridge stood at the far end of the room, looking like a king on his throne. He had the documents on a small table beside him, ready for the signing ceremony. The emotional tension was at a breaking point. I could feel the gazes of 100 people pressing against me. Cressida was standing near the Halveridges, her face like a mask of glass. The compression of the moment was so intense I could barely breathe. Who would speak first? Who would pull the trigger? Lucian led me straight to the front of the room, ignoring the murmurs. He didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped onto the dais and held up a single hand. "Stop," he said, and the word echoed through the hall like a gunshot. The public reckoning was explosive. Lucian didn't waste time with polite words. He began to speak about the logs Sir Allard had given us. He spoke about the lawyer's fake departure and the pressure put on my great-uncle. Lord Halveridge tried to laugh it off, calling it the delusions of a desperate man, but Lucian was prepared. He signaled to the door, and the lawyer himself walked in, flanked by 2 officers of the court. The truth disrupted the narrative so violently that some people actually cried out. The lawyer hadn't gone to the continent. He had been hiding in a safe house Lucian had provided, waiting for the right moment to testify. He began to tell the story of the forgery and the threats. The room erupted in chaos. The charitable trust was exposed as a front for Lord Halveridge's personal debts. The scandal that had been used to bury me was now the fire that was burning the Halveridges alive. I stood there, watching the faces of the people who had judged me, and saw their shock turn to horror. The architects of my ruin were being dismantled in front of the entire world. The hidden architect was finally fully revealed. It wasn't just Lord Halveridge, it was a whole network of men who had been profiting from the theft of estates for years. The blame shifted dramatically. The guests who had been so quick to condemn me were now looking at their own friends with suspicion. The social order of the season was in ruins. I looked at Lady Cressida. She had collapsed into a chair, her face buried in her hands. She had been a part of it, but she had been a pawn in a game that was much bigger and crueler than she had imagined. The Halveridges were led out of the room in a silence that was far more powerful than any applause. I felt a strange sense of emptiness. The war was over, but the landscape was changed forever. I wasn't the girl I had been at the start of the season. I was someone who had seen the darkness behind the silk, and I didn't know if I could ever go back to pretending it wasn't there. Lady Cressida's composure finally fractured completely. As the room cleared and the authorities took their statements, she stayed in her chair, shivering. I walked over to her, not because I wanted to gloat, but because I wanted to see the person who had tried so hard to destroy me. When she looked up, her eyes were full of a raw, human fear. "I didn't know about the murder," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I just wanted to be safe. I thought if I had the money, they couldn't hurt us anymore." My response was uncertain. Part of me wanted to scream at her, to tell her about the nights I had spent crying because of her lies. But another part of me saw the girl who had been used just as much as I had. She had made a choice to be a predator, but she had ended up as prey. I looked at her and felt a weary kind of pity. She had lost everything, not just her reputation, but her sense of who she was. "You chose the wrong side, Cressida," I said quietly. "And now you have to live with the wreckage." I refused to engage in any vengeance theatrics. When the reporters and the gossip-mongers tried to get me to speak ill of the fallen families, I simply shook my head and walked away. I refused to be the tragic victim or the vengeful survivor. My dignity was my own, and I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of a scene. The crowd was stunned by my restraint. They wanted drama, they wanted a show. But by staying quiet, I was showing them that I was more than the scandal they had tried to define me by. I was a Davenforth, and I was going to rebuild my family's name on my own terms. Lucian stood by me, his pride in me visible in every line of his body. He had claimed me before society when I was at my lowest, and now he was standing with me as I rose. We were a pair that no one expected, and that was our greatest strength. In the quiet of the aftermath, Lucian gave me the final revelation. We were back in his library, the same place where he had confessed his carelessness. He pulled out a small, gold locket that had belonged to my great-uncle. "He wasn't just my target, Ophelia," Lucian said softly. "He was my godfather. He was the one who taught me everything I know about honor. Everything aligned." Lucian hadn't just been helping me out of guilt or attraction. He had been fighting for the man who had been a father to him when his own father was cold and distant. He had kept that secret because he didn't want the Halveridges to know how personal the fight was. He had been a protector for a lifetime, not just a season. I looked at him and felt a surge of love that was so powerful it took my breath away. He had risked everything to honor a dead man and save a girl he barely knew. He was the man I had always hoped existed, and he was mine. Respectability was being rewritten in the townhomes and ballrooms. The Everwick Davenforth story was no longer a scandal, it was a legend. The social narrative shifted violently as people tried to claim they had always known the Halveridges were villains and that I was a hero. It was hypocritical and shallow, but it was the world we lived in. Personal closure was still pending, though. I had the inheritance and the name, but I still had to decide what my life would look like. I wasn't sure if I wanted to stay in London, among the people who had been so quick to turn on me. I looked at the invites piling up on the table and felt a sense of boredom. I had seen the truth, and the glitter of the ton no longer held any magic for me. I wanted something real. I wanted a life that wasn't a performance. I requested one final meeting with Lady Cressida. We met in a quiet park, away from the prying eyes of the servants. She was dressed in black, her face thin and tired. There were no masks left between us. We sat on a bench and watched the birds for a long time without speaking. "What will you do?" I asked. She sighed, a long, weary sound. "My father is taking us to the country. We're selling everything. I'll be a nameless girl in a nameless village, and I think I prefer it that way." She looked at me, and for the first time, there was no malice in her gaze. "You were stronger than I thought, Ophelia. I should have realized that a girl who can survive a season like this is a girl who can survive anything." It was the closest we would ever get to a reconciliation. We were two survivors of a war that had unmade us both. As she walked away, I saw the fear that had lived beneath her strategy. She had been fighting for survival her whole life, but she had been fighting the wrong people. Her vulnerability was real, and it gave her an emotional depth I hadn't seen when she was draped in silk. She was a tragedy, a warning of what happens when you let the world choose your weapons for you. I felt a sense of peace as I watched her disappear into the trees. I didn't hate her anymore. I just felt sorry for her. She had spent her whole life trying to be respectable, and it had nearly cost her her soul. I was the one who had been unmade, but I was the one who had come out whole. I turned and walked in the opposite direction, toward the life that was waiting for me. I chose mercy without weakness. I didn't push for the maximum sentence for Cressida's father, and I helped ensure that their smaller estate wasn't seized by the bank. I didn't do it for them, I did it for me. I didn't want their blood on my hands, and I didn't want to be the person who took everything from a family. My firm compassion was an unexpected emotional shift for the ton. They didn't understand why I wasn't more vengeful. But Lucien understood. He stood by me as I signed the papers, his hand on my shoulder. "You're a better person than they deserve, Ophelia," he said. I looked at him and smiled. "I'm just a person who knows what it's like to lose everything, Lucien. I wouldn't wish it on anyone." We walked out of the lawyer's office into the bright afternoon sun, the weight of the past finally falling away. The silence that had started at Lady Halveridge's gala finally broke. It was a hard-earned understanding between us and the world. We weren't the same people we had been, but we were better. We were a duke and a girl from a boarding house who had changed the rules of the game. Lucien waited for me at the bottom of the steps of my new home. He didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes was all the conversation I needed. We were going to the country, far away from the whispers and the scandals. We were going to build a life on the land my great-uncle had loved. I walked down the steps and took his hand, feeling the solid, reliable heat of him. The silence was no longer heavy. It was full of the future. The choice that defied expectation was finally made. I stood with Lucien on the balcony of our country house, watching the sun set over the hills. My dignity had been restored, and my emotional closure was complete. I had been unmade by the season, but I had been remade by the truth. Love had been validated not through a rescue, but through public courage. We had stood together when it was dangerous, and now we were together when it was safe. The season would come and go, with its whispers and its silks, but we were beyond its reach. We had found something that couldn't be unmade by a rumor or a scandal. We had found ourselves, and we had found each other. I leaned my head on Lucien's shoulder, watching the first stars appear in the sky. We were finally home, and the world was finally quiet.